has the title From Marinus to Saint Marina. And Marinus is a male name, Marina is a female name. And another title could have been Marina the Monk. I went to Venice a couple of years ago. Actually, it's the second time I was there. It was very busy. I visited all the regular touristy sites, like St. Mark's, the Basilica, the Doge's Palace, and I went on a gondola ride in the canal. But I missed a place that would be at the top of my list for the next visit. It's a church, and the name of the church is Santa Maria Formosa. Formosa actually means the one that is well built, well filled out, and you wonder why that's associated with an image of Maria. You will figure that out in a moment. The building is of architectural interest, and some people visit it for that reason, not all that many. But just as one goes inside the building, there's a glass cage with the body of Saint Marina fully preserved, and therefore Formosa, as the name says, even though she lived and died around the 5th century. Nearby the glass coffin is the cloth that originally covered her body. And that cloth is covered with a Coptic design, which is from the late Egyptian period. What's it doing in Venice? So I looked up Marina. And when you look up Saint Marina, it can be confusing when you go online because there are two Saint Marinas. There's this one, and there's another one called Saint Marina the Martyr. And when you have the martyr in your name, that means that something terrible has happened to you. Indeed, she was executed. So we're not looking at that one, we're looking at the other Saint Marina. There are quite a few articles online about her and also books, and I consulted some of those articles. Marina, as she was called, came from a well-to-do Christian family in the area that would now be called Lebanon. It used to be called the Levant. And the place in particular that she grew up in is now called Al-Kalamun. And she is celebrated there. Marina's mother died when she was a young girl. And her father raised her until it was time to find her a husband. His plan was to join a monastery for men and lead a spiritual life. Marina begged him, "Don't marry me off. I too want to join a monastery with you." How to do that? But she was a slender young woman. Slender, yes, but not a young man. And she convinced her father ultimately to let her shave her head and pretend to be a boy and to be named Marinus, or Marinos, as some people call her. Her voice was rather soft, but that was explained by the father to be the result of her frequent, constant prayers. So Marinus was accepted in the monastery and led a very pious life. After a few years, the father passed away and Marinus kept living there. one day, Marinus, or really Marina, was engaged in some tasks in the nearby village. And there something really dramatic happened. A young woman from the village had become pregnant by a soldier, and that soldier had moved on. So she accused the monk Marinus of causing her pregnancy. Her father had told Marinus then that he better take care of raising that infant. Marinus did not say the obvious truth, hey, I am a woman, and couldn't possibly have caused somebody to become pregnant. Instead, quietly, humbly, Marinus took the infant and cared for it. Of course, Marinus the monk was evicted from the monastery and had to live outside the walls, in poverty, doing everything in their power to take care of the child. After a few years had gone by, the monks in the monastery were so impressed with the humble efforts of Marinus to do this task day in, day out of caring for an infant, looking for food and shelter, that they petitioned the abbot to let Marinus come back to the monastery. And yes, Marinus was permitted to come back. But not in good standing. Marinus now had to do the most menial tasks related to cleaning, cooking, and so on, in addition to spiritual practice. Many more years went by, and Marinus also passed away. And as the body was prepared for burial, it was obvious that Marinus was Marina, a woman and a virgin at that, and that brought up some thoughts of immaculate conception in a monastery. So, all of a sudden, Marina became highly venerated as a saint and became known as Marina the monk henceforth. Now, that still doesn't place Marina in Venice. That has something to do, again, with the Crusades. During the plunders of the Crusades, specifically in the Fourth Crusade, a lot of relics were stolen and brought back to Istanbul and from there to other locations. That's why there are so many of these relics in all kinds of West European countries and East European countries, because they were stolen from the Holy Land. That crusade happened in the 13th century, and the Doge of Venice was one of its leaders. So some relics went to Venice and the rest of Italy. And this particular relic, the body of Saint Marina, minus the left hand which remained in the monastery, I think there might have been some negotiation going on. But her body was brought to Venice, and it was kept there in a succession of churches. And the last one of them is the Church of Santa Maria Formosa. Now, for those who don't believe that divine intervention caused the body to remain in such good condition over so many centuries, you may remember that the dry desert conditions where she had lived and died in Lebanon may provide an alternative explanation. Either one. There are other such relics in Italy. And in fact, a pilgrimage or a touristy trip that people used to take in the late Middle Ages to see such relics, some people still do that. There are people who go to Istanbul to see the remaining relics there. In fact, when I was in Istanbul, I went to the Topkapi Palace. Have any of you been there? Well, in Topkapi, there are two really amazing things, among numerous other amazing things. One is the staff of Moses. And the other one is a piece of the skull of St. John and a piece of the arm of St. John the Baptist. And skeptics might wonder, how did those two come together or stay together if you think about what happened to St. John the Baptist? But you have to suspend your disbelief when you see these relics. They are really, really impressive. Now back to Marina. While her story is indeed fascinating and a great example of a person who led a spiritual life and also did the humble and good deed when it was needed, there is another story, and that comes from the other end of the world. And that story has remarkable similarities to the story of Marina the monk. In fact, when I read her story first, I was thinking, hey, that sounds just like this other story. Well, Marina's story was recorded in writing in many different ways. It's in a book about the saints that was written in the 13th century called The Golden Legend. And that was written by Jacobus de Voragine in that time of that Fourth Crusade. And it's a famous collection of saints. That's also called a hagiography. And the lives that were recorded in there include the life of Saint Marina, based on earlier traditions that had kept her story alive. And since that time, she has become the patron saint of women, of girls, and also more recently of transgender people. Now, this other story I mentioned comes to us from Japan, ancient Japan, and ancient China before that. The Zen master named Hakuin, who was born at the end of the 17th century, was quite important in the development of the Rinzai Zen movement. In Rinzai Zen, disciples who practice are assigned riddles to mull over in their minds, and those are called koans. They're supposed to think about them while they meditate and eventually reach enlightenment. Now, there are other movements in Zen that totally abhor the use of these kinds of things to reach enlightenment and to meditate. And of the thousands of koans that once existed, not all have remained. There are about 101, well, exactly 101 that were recorded in a book called 101 Zen Koans. You can find it in all kinds of formats if you Google the title. And some of those koans, like I said, are just simple little riddles. There's a favorite one that people always mention, and it's called, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" And some disciples may think about that for years, and then come back to their teacher and say, "I found another angle." Nobody really says, "I got it," because, I had one Zen master who was my teacher, but in another tradition, in the Soto tradition, he said, "This is the answer." And I was thinking, no, you're not supposed to say that, come on. But anyway, so I'm not going to tell you what he said. but it is one of them. And some of these koans, instead of just being these little riddles, they're more like stories. And here is a story that used to be, and still is, I think, my favorite koan story. It is called, Is That So? And here it is. One day, the monk Hakuin was in a village. One young woman in the village, the daughter of the innkeeper, had become pregnant by a soldier. Does this begin to sound familiar? And the soldier had left the village. So she accused Hakuin, who was working in the village, of being the father. And his reply was, Is that so? The young woman and her father told Hakuin that he'd better take responsibility for that infant and take it with him to raise it. Is that so? Hakuin said again. Hakuin spent several months taking care of the infant without complaining. After several months had gone by, the mother felt very guilty and admitted to her father that it was a soldier and not Hakuin who had fathered the child. She now wanted to raise the child herself and asked for it back. So when she and her father came to the monastery to request that the child be returned, Hakuin simply said, Is that so? And let them take the child back. That sentence, Is that so? Is a sentence that speaks of embodied resilience, in particular, equanimity. Thousands of miles and hundreds of years separate Marina, the Christian monk, and Hakuin, the Zen monk. But they both acted in the same way. They both accepted the infant. They both took care of the infant. And they both averted the potential catastrophe of the woman being punished severely and the child possibly killed. Those two monks, one an innocent male monk and the other one an innocent female monk, used what Buddhists called skillful means to deal with the situation at hand. And you can only use skillful means if your mind is in a state of equanimity. Otherwise, you tend to just burst out, I couldn't possibly have done that, and then things start rolling in a dangerous direction. So they did it automatically, because that kind of response was already embodied in them. Is that so? They embodied resilience and equanimity. And may we continue to learn from their examples. Let us breathe a few moments on that. Let us now rise in body or spirit or both to sing hymn number 6 in the Grey Hymnal. That is number 6, just as long as I have breath.